looking at German landscape artist Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1817. We see this gentleman, and he's actually dressed as a dandy, who's kind of like an upper middle class European in the 19th century. And he's climbed up to this rocky outcropping, and he looks out at this sea of fog below him, and he sees these rocks and these mountains that he has climbed up and sort of metaphorically conquered to make it to the top of this mountain. And this is a great quote by John Lewis Gaddis. We see a view that suggests at once mastery over a landscape and the insignificance of the individual within it. We see no face, so it's impossible to know whether the prospect facing the young man here is exhilarating or terrifying or both. This is a great definition of the sublime. So in this video, we're going to talk about what is the sublime and how does it relate to this style that we know of as Romanticism. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. What is Romanticism? Romanticism is the first truly modern art movement. And it's not really about romance in the way that Rococo art was about love and romantic themes. Instead, it's about embracing emotion and intuition. It's a rejection of neoclassicism. So in the tradition of the youth, the Romantics come along and reject the art style of the generation that came before them, that is neoclassicism. And along with rejecting neoclassicism, they're also rejecting reason and logic in favor of emotion and intuition. This art movement is inspired by the Kantian notion of artistic independence, that the artist is free and independent of the patron. But the romantic artist is in a precarious position. The artist must develop an individual style. So there's a great deal of freedom, but the artist in some ways may also feel enslaved to the new art world audience. So the idea here is that you need to create content or art that is consumable, that people will want to buy. And so then are you losing some of that creative freedom because you are bound to your clients? And I think that this tension is very real for the postmodern artists, for the artists today in the 2020s. We see in the Romantic period, a redefining of the role of the artist in society. We see a distrust of rationalism and an embracing of experience, of authenticity, of authentic emotions over reason and logic and rationalism. We also see the introduction of a new concept known as the sublime, which I will explain shortly. Romanticism as a movement is something that we see not only in the visual arts, but it's also a philosophical movement, a literary movement, and a musical movement. And we will see in general that this style of art and artistic expression is a rejection against neoclassicism, a rejection of reason, an embracing of imagination, of emotion, of individualism. There is an emphasis on the spirit of the individual to overcome the problems of society. And there's a strong interest in the personal ability of the artist and of the artist's autobiography. And the idea is that, like, the artist is the subject. The artist experiences all of these emotions and that they can bring this out on the canvas. We will also see with Romanticism an appreciation of the common man, the commoner, an appreciation for nature, and an embracing a bit of melancholy. It's kind of emo. It's kind of brooding. It's definitely a bourgeois luxury. Working class people don't have time to sit around being depressed. They've got to get to work. But the bourgeoisie has a bit of time to sit around and contemplate how empty their lives feel. We also see, as we look at Romanticism in painting, the development of landscape painting. And this is tied to the way humans start thinking about nature. Remember, in the modern era, people have moved from rural societies to urbanized environments. People are working in factories, they're living in cities. And for people at the time, there is a nostalgia for the pre-industrial society. As people are disconnected from nature, as they live in urban environments, that they're not surrounded by trees and birds chirping every day, that they long for and have a nostalgia for the countryside. And in fact, we start to see the development of this kind of bourgeois tourism industry of people escaping from the city and going out into the countryside for respite and for painting retreats. And even the modern idea of the artist residency stems from this time period. Now, remember our historical context. We're coming out of the American Revolution, the American War from Independence, from 1775 to 1783. We're coming out of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. And by 1803, Napoleon is crowned Emperor of France. In France especially, it's a time period of expansion and colonialism. It's against this backdrop of this historical context that we see this new interest in the imagination, in individuality, and idealizing and romanticizing of human life and of humans' relationship with nature. We have this nostalgia for the pre-industrial moment. And we have a new term to define the tension of this era, the tension that humans feel as they are kind of pulled between progress and nostalgia. So let's look, for example, at Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea from 1809-1810. The first time I saw this painting, I was sitting in an art history class, and I saw it up on the big screen, and then I was overwhelmed by this massive expanse of sky, of clouds, of landscape, this seascape before my eyes. And I heard the professor lecturing about this painting, and he kept going on and on about a monk. And I couldn't for the life of me find the monk until I looked way down here, and you can see on this rocky outcropping above a stormy sea, a tiny little figure. This is the monk by the sea. Now, when we look at this painting, we can see that the sky, if you divide the painting into like horizontal planes, the sky itself is taking up over 2/3 of the entire canvas. Then we have a dark sliver of the sea looking very, very tumultuous, very dark, very mysterious, and maybe very terrifying. Then we have a little bit of a rocky outcropping, perhaps a cliff above the sea, and this tiny human figure staring out at this vast expanse of a massive landscape and a huge storm at sea. If you look to the horizon, you can see where the sky meets the water, dark, dark clouds, rain, and a storm coming our way. Yet, if you look to the top of the picture plane, you will see some blue sky peeking through. So perhaps a symbol of hope. Now, have you ever stood at the sea? Have you ever stood on a cliff or stood on the sand and gazed out to the horizon, watched the waves roll in, watched the clouds move across the sky, and contemplated your own existence? Have you ever seen the stars on a clear night while you're up in the mountains or out in the desert? I live in an urban environment, so if I can get up to the mountains or out to the deserts, Joshua Tree or Coachella Valley, I can get a glimpse of the stars. Otherwise, It's very difficult in an urban environment for me to see the stars. Have you ever seen a rainbow as you're driving out of a rainstorm? Have you ever been overwhelmed by the beauty and power of nature? Have you ever listened to a song in a language that you can't even understand and cried because you were overwhelmed by emotions? Have you ever looked at a work of art and wept? I know I had an experience like this. The first time I was 18 years old and I went into the Vatican and I saw Michelangelo's Pietà, a statue of Mary holding the body of her dead son. And I, not a religious person, a person who was raised Catholic and deeply disillusioned by the history of the Catholic Church, I stood in front of that statue and wept because I was overwhelmed with awe. I was overwhelmed with emotion as I stood in front of this work of creation. This is a sublime experience. If you really want to experience a sublime experience, you should check out Double Rainbow Guy. I would say pause now, go watch Double Rainbow Guy. If you watch Double Rainbow Guy, you will see that this is a story of a man who lived out in Yosemite and he's witnessing a double rainbow all the way across the sky, and he is overwhelmed by the beauty and majesty of nature, but also by the power of nature. And at a certain point, he begins to weep. He is crying, and he's pleading sort of with the universe, with God, with whatever you want to call it. And he's saying, what does it mean? Tell me, what does it mean? And he doesn't mean, what does it mean scientifically? He's not asking you to explain how light refracts off of particles of water. He's asking in a philosophical way, what is the meaning of me witnessing such beauty from Mother Earth? What is the meaning of my existence in the grand scheme of things? He's really having an existential moment, and he's overwhelmed by the beauty, by the power, by the awe that nature is presenting to him. And he's feeling humbled. He's feeling insignificant in the grand scheme of things. This is the same way that I felt when I was lying out on a rock in Joshua Tree, staring up at the sky, viewing the Milky Way galaxy with the naked eye, just feeling so tiny, where you're so tiny that whatever problems you have in the world seem insignificant in comparison. And in some ways that's a scary feeling because I'm so small, I'm so insignificant, my life means nothing. But there's also a great deal of freedom in that. So it doesn't matter if I make a little mistake. It doesn't matter if I eat too much cheese today. It doesn't matter because I'm free, because life is this big, vast, long thing, and the universe goes on and on forever, and I'm this tiny little speck. So nobody cares if I said something dumb or embarrassed myself. It's not a big deal. It all comes out in the wash. So there's a great deal of freedom in this terror. This is the sublime experience. The tension that we feel between the fear, the terror at the power of nature, at the power of creation, at art's ability to move us. That is a terrifying vulnerability, but that's also the beauty of life. That's also the freedom. That's also the pleasure. So that tension, that line between disgust and awe, that is the sublime experience. In aesthetics, the sublime is that quality of greatness, whether physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, spiritual, artistic. This term refers to a kind of greatness beyond all possibility of calculation. This is the feeling you have when you're standing in front of the Grand Canyon and looking at something that's almost seemingly beyond measure, seemingly beyond imitation, beyond all calculation, that there's no way to capture its beauty. You try to take a picture of it and it just doesn't capture that feeling of being there, present in the moment, witnessing this scene with your own eyes. That overwhelming feeling of at once being inspired by this awesome power, by the wonderful power of nature, but it's also terrifying. One wrong step and your life is over. Nature has the power to knock you off. A little bit of loose dirt on your hike, a gust of wind, and you're gone. We are so powerless and so weak in the face of nature. And that is the sublime experience, to feel that, to have that provoked by either nature or art or music, to have that feeling of being overwhelmed by our feelings, by our emotions, that our emotions overwhelm logic. This is the sublime experience. The poet Victor Hugo defined the sublime as a combination of the grotesque and the beautiful. There's that tension between awe and terror. And this is all opposed to that classical ideal of perfection, that neoclassical concept that art and life is about achieving perfection. Here the Romantics say, actually, art is a mess, life is a mess, and we're going to feel it all. There's something very idealized and romantic about this sublime experience. The sublime experience, whether in nature or in art, is something that inspires awe and reverence. It's an experience in which an emotional understanding transcends rational thought, transcends words or language. For the Romantics, the sublime is a meeting of the subjective, internal, emotional world with the objective, external, natural world. That we allow our emotions to overwhelm the rationality that we experience, and we're experiencing the wonder of creation. And perhaps when we look at Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, when we have this stormy sky and this dark sea take up most of this canvas that overwhelm this tiny figure, we have a sense of impending doom. The monk is dwarfed by this massive landscape, and that the vastness of the landscape overwhelms the viewer too. This can be read as a depiction of a sublime experience, that existential anxiety that a human has when faced with their own smallness, their own mortality even. When this painting was first shown at the Berlin Academy in 1810, it received some mixed reactions. A lot of people didn't like it because it was too abstract. That this painting is about this huge, massive sky, and that there's an emptiness, this gap between the monk and the viewer, that there's difficulty for the viewer to enter into this painting, that there are none of the traditional elements of landscape painting here that help to soften the composition. There's no pathway of flowers leading us into the scene. There's just this kind of very simple, almost abstracted composition. There's the sky, this dark black sea, and this tiny sliver of foreground. There's this flatness to the painting. There's an abstraction to the painting that's a very modern idea. And in fact, I love this quote. Listen to this. The art critic Heinrich Kleist famously wrote, "Since in its monotony and boundlessness it has no foreground except the frame, when viewing it, it is as if one's eyelids had been cut away." It's a very dramatic take on the painting, but you catch his drift, that there's no foreground. There's just this little sliver of land, a vast sea of blackness, a void, almost a black hole that threatens to suck us into it, and a stormy sky off in the distance. This is what it feels like to be on the edge. You know, if you've suffered with any kind of mental illness, I personally have suffered from depression. This was always the feeling for me of being on the edge of a depressive episode, where standing on this cliff and this vast gaping hole threatens to suck me in. I can laugh about it now. If you've been there, if you've had that feeling, you know what I'm talking about. So let's look at another Caspar David Friedrich. We're back here with The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And again, you can see this dandy dressed in his kind of fine suit. It's not exactly hiking gear, but he makes it up to this rocky outcropping and he's looking out at the scene below him. Maybe you've felt this. You've gone on a hike and you've made it to the top of the mountain. Maybe you felt powerful. You felt strong, like, I defeated that mountain. I conquered it. I won the race, the race against myself to the top. There is a sense of accomplishment in making it to the top of a mountain. But it takes one misstep. It takes one gust of wind or one loose rock to take your life away in an instant. And that tension of feeling empowered, feeling as if you have dominated nature, and the ability for nature to remind you that no, you have not won. Nature will always win. Here we see that tension depicted perfectly. Here we see Caspar David Friedrich's typical use of an art historical trope called a Rücken figure. The Rücken figure is the figure with their back to the viewer. And the viewer identifies themselves with this back-facing figure and perhaps with the artist himself. The Rücken figure draws the viewer into the picture conceptually and kind of spiritually, not unlike the monk who is cut off from the viewer. So through the figure of the monk, through the Rücken figure, we imagine ourselves standing on this rocky outcropping. And in fact, I felt this feeling before. I was hiking in Ojai with a friend. She snapped a picture of me and I said, oh my gosh, I am a Rücken figure. I look like Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, looking out at this vast landscape that I feel I have conquered, and now I'm ready for brunch. Let's look at a couple more works by Friedrich. Here we're looking at Friedrich's Giant Mountains from 1830 to 1835. And you can see with paintings like this, Friedrich is really reacting to the rapid industrialization and urbanization of Western Europe. And all of this industrialization provokes a nostalgia for the countryside and a nostalgia for country landscapes. Some of this is as a result of Enlightenment ideas. We see, especially in Protestant countries, as a result of Enlightenment ideas, so the rejection of sort of faith in favor of empirical evidence, that some people begin to equate God with nature. And during Romanticism, we see that individuals derive personal satisfaction and in some cases spiritual enlightenment through direct contact with nature. And I think that this is a pretty common conception even today. Have you ever said to anyone on the internet, go touch grass? That's what this is about. Touching grass is connecting you back to nature and therefore to a kind of spiritual experience. We will also see in Romantic paintings, especially in some of these works by Friedrich, an interest in ruins, in fallen abbeys, in decay, in detritus. Here we're looking at Eldina ruins from 1825, where we see the crumbling walls of an abbey, a small cottage in the countryside, and two tiny figures dwarfed by these magnificent ruins. But you will see that even though the ruins are huge and they're still hanging in there, nature has taken over. Trees have started to grow outside of the ruins. It's kind of like when you're walking down the street and you see a little flower sprout up in between the cracks of the sidewalk. Nature always finds a way. Nature always takes over. So we have these almost dystopian views of landscapes where nature has reclaimed that which was built by humanity. This is a common trope in film today. I'm thinking of The Last of Us. And of course, there are scenes of these kind of cities that have been overgrown and that nature has taken over. You will also see in paintings like Friedrich's Abbey in the Oakwood, 1808 to 1810, again, that crumbling abbey, and in this instance, these kind of scraggly trees, a dark winter scene, really a vision that is like a scene from a horror movie, and it brings to bear on all of the subjects of these Gothic cliches of the late 18th century and the early 19th century. This is the era of Goya's Saturn devouring his child. This is the era of Henry Fuseli's Nightmare. This is the era of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And in fact, I would say, like, if Friedrich were alive today, he'd probably be a goth, you know? Here we are looking at Friedrich's Man and Woman Contemplating the Moon from 1824, and you will notice the Rücken figure. We, as the viewer, identify ourselves with the Rücken figure as if we're standing out on this rocky promontory in the woods viewing the moon from this promontory. That we too might be overwhelmed by the beauty of the moon. I know I am. We will see the sublime depicted in other landscape works. I'm thinking of Joseph M.W. Turner's Snowstorm, Hannibal and his Army Crossing the Alps from 1812. You'll notice when we look at Friedrich, we see these landscapes, these dramatic landscapes with these anonymous individuals. That's not really considered appropriate subject matter for the Academy, which is why some of his paintings were kind of met with mixed reviews. And we see Turner solving that problem by depicting what he really experienced in real life, which is an alpine snowstorm. Turner actually traveled throughout Europe, and he went from the UK down through the Alps, and he experienced a dramatic snowstorm where he kept notes and did sketches, and then later brought this back into the studio and painted this dramatic snowstorm where, you know, humans are overwhelmed by the power of nature, and he situates it within this historical context of, you know, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. So a scene from ancient history gives some context to what is really a painting about the snowstorm itself. And it's so funny that that's the case, because like I said, I was just watching The Last of Us, and in addition to these dystopian views, you also see humans surviving snowstorms out in the wild. So there's this element of danger and wildness to nature that we see depicted in the paintings, and the landscape paintings especially, by the Romantics. Humans are rendered insignificant in the face of this swirling vortex of the snowstorm. It's a wild and chaotic composition that really portrays the sublime experience. And instead of these minute, brushless details that are favored by the academic painters, I'm thinking of The Oath of the Horatii, Turner instead paints thickly and coarsely and quickly and sort of mimics the drama of the storm through the way he paints. And it's a very apocalyptic vision, a very terrifying vision of the awe and the power of nature. Turner is also making paintings about humans' relationship between technology and nature. So Turner was an avid traveler, and his life was transformed by the rapid spread of railroads around Europe. This mechanized speed was associated with modernity. He tried to depict the exhilaration of riding at a fast speed, the excitement of modern life. I think of a railroad in the 1800s as sort of like people being on their first transatlantic flight, or even now we have humans traveling up into space. It's a very modern idea to move at such a speed, and this was something very new at the time. So here we see Turner's Rain Steam Speed, the Great Western Railway from 1844, and what we see is a train rushing across a bridge and a very loose, very wild, dramatic landscape, some water below, a landscape off in the distance, and we see a depiction of like kind of this misty weather and the steam, the combustion from the engine and the rapid movement of the train. And so I know for us, traveling in a train doesn't seem that futuristic, but there is an embracing of the moment. Have you ever seen a dog stick its head out of a car window, just feeling the wind? Have you ever been on a motorcycle or in a convertible, feeling the wind blow through your hair? Or even sometimes if you're driving down the road and you might stick a hand out the window and feel the wind move against your hand on a warm, sunny day. There you're really experiencing the speed of movement. And this is what Turner is trying to capture here. Something very modern, a very modern experience of racing through space and time. And like Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, we see a very abstract painting here. It's a very early date for a very abstract painting. It's almost non-figurative. You get a glimpse of a bridge and a train, but otherwise it's sort of just color on the canvas. Very modern idea to paint in such an abstract way. Now, even amongst the Romantics, there were more conservative types of painters. I'm thinking of John Constable's The Hay Wain here from 1821. Constable was perhaps less impressed with technological innovation than Turner was, and he had a more conservative view of this nostalgia for nature. He was instead motivated by an aversion to the changes of modernism. He really thought of his art as a protest against mechanization of agriculture. He thinks of these things as a disruption of the traditional ways, and it's a more conservative view, a wariness, a skepticism, a healthy skepticism, we might say, of these technological advancements. Constable was also known for his geographic determinism, and this is a theory positing that an individual's character and temperament were molded by the climate and the geography of their childhood. And in fact, unlike Turner, who traveled throughout Europe, Constable never traveled far from his home region, and he depicted that home region in paintings like The Hay Wain. He really idealizes this romantic view of the countryside. It's not about the harsh realities of farm labor. Instead, it's a picturesque view of the landscape, and it's a comforting view of the countryside for Constable's London art world. Constable was financially independent, and so he could just sort of paint what he wanted. He didn't really need to worry about selling paintings. He was actually successful. He won a gold medal for this painting. He is really credited with attempting to raise the level of landscape painting through his large-scale 6-footers, as they're called. They're 6-foot large-scale landscape painting. So he's bringing painting on a large scale, usually something that's reserved for history painting, he's bringing that to the landscape. When the Hay Wain was displayed at the French Salon, it influenced a group of French painters, and they founded what is referred to as the Barbizon School. It's a group of artists who are united by the common practice of painting unpretentious views of the French countryside. There's this group of young painters who would get together, and in the summer they would retire to the Fontainebleau forest, France's first major sort of tourist destination, and they would walk down the scenic paths and paint picturesque landscapes. And they were really trying to avoid and escape from the noise and the filth and the expense of modern urban Paris. And they escaped to this fabulous countryside area where they're painting and taking in some fresh air and sunshine. And in fact, this almost is kind of like the modern day concept of the artist residency, where an artist retires from society and goes out into the landscape to rest and be inspired and make art. Now, we see this interest in landscape painting not just in Europe, but also in the US at the time. Here we're looking at Thomas Cole's Adirondacks from 1838. And like the Barbizon School in France, the Hudson River School flourished in the United States. Again, it's a group of artists known for depicting these landscapes. The landscape had a special status as symbolic of the United States as the land of opportunity. You have to remember that a lot of Europeans in the United States at the time had this concept of manifest destiny, an idea that white European colonizers should decide the fate of the continent and should be free to move across the continent as indigenous populations are moved to reservations. Now, Thomas Cole was born in England and he moved to the US with his family, and then he later returned to Europe where he was influenced by Constable's idealized landscapes and the work of the Barbizon School. Like the Barbizon School artists, the Hudson River School artists romanticized the fresh air, the twittering birds of the countryside, and this was all seen in contrast to the smoggy air and the noisy streets of New York City. Now, we could go on and on talking about these romantic landscape paintings, but I want you to tell me. Let me know in the comments. Have you had a sublime experience? Was it inspired by nature or perhaps by art, by a musical performance? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to know more about Romanticism, stay tuned for the next video. We're going to continue our discussion of Romanticism. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more Art Trippin lecture series.